morning, everyone. My name is Jaime Castillo. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary here at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we want to welcome you here for this media briefing ahead of the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Today, you're going to hear from Secretary Castro and several senior HUD policy experts who have worked tirelessly on the Gulf recovery from day one. Before I turn it over to Secretary Castro, I want to let you know that we'll be taking questions later in the program from the assembled media that's here, as well as viewers on the HUD webcast at C-SPAN 2. And we encourage you to send in your questions via Twitter at HUDGov or hashtag Katrina, or by email at HUDpublicaffairs@HUD.gov. That's HUDpublicaffairs@HUD.gov. And without further delay, join me in welcoming HUD Secretary Julian Castro.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Jaime, for the introduction. And let me just begin by thanking all the journalists who are here today at HUD headquarters, as well as those who I know are joining us over the internet. In the coming days, Americans will turn to you as we commemorate the tragedy that befell our nation a decade ago. A disaster so terrible that for all of us, it will be remembered by simply one word: Katrina. They'll turn to our journalists to recount what so many endured and what none of us can forget. And amid the devastating numbers, more than 1,800 lives lost, more than 1 million Americans displaced, 1 million homes destroyed across 5 states, $150 billion in economic damage. Amid all of those numbers, Americans will also look for answers. How much progress have we made in the years since Katrina, particularly in New Orleans, which was the hardest hit community? And what are we doing to continue supporting the housing and overall recovery in the affected communities? Today is about providing answers, but it's also about more than that. We're also reaffirming HUD's commitment to the people of the Gulf to continue working with them and for them until the job of recovery is complete. You see, as long as there are people who want to come home and communities that need to be rebuilt, our job is not done. That's the true meaning of commemoration. Not to simply mark a date on our calendars, but to ensure that remembering also renews our devotion to those we lost, our dedication to support those who suffered, and our resolve to see the promise of our nation made to New Orleans and to the Gulf fulfilled. 10 years ago, I was proud to live in a community that stepped up to support evacuees in the earliest days of Katrina. Roughly 25,000 to 35,000 people fleeing the storm's devastation came to San Antonio. And we were just one of many cities whose residents opened their arms to families in need. Across the nation, HUD played an important role to help displaced families find housing and to get back on their feet. HUD partnered with more than 300 public housing authorities in 49 states to provide stable housing for nearly 37,000 families. In the Gulf Coast states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, and Florida, HUD worked closely with disaster recovery leaders to support an ongoing recovery. Through our Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Initiative, we've invested nearly $20 billion to create new housing, develop new infrastructure, and bolster the Gulf Coast region's economy. Nearly $14 billion of that funding has gone directly to support the region's housing market. HUD has provided compensation for 158,000 affected households. We've also helped nearly 2,900 families to buy new homes, and we've created almost 36,000 new units of affordable housing while rehabilitating another 13,000 housing units. HUD was also central in the redevelopment of damaged public housing throughout the Gulf, especially in what were known as New Orleans' Big Four developments. Katrina displaced 3,000 families living in those public housing buildings. Today, in 2015, 4 new, attractive, mixed-income developments are a vital part of community life in New Orleans. And the New Orleans Housing Authority, which once was beset by mismanagement and under receivership by HUD, has made an impressive turnaround and was returned to local control in 2014. As part of HUD's work to support the region's broader economic recovery, our agency also invested $1.6 billion to replace and improve streets, utilities, sewer lines, schools, hospitals, and dams. In New Orleans alone, HUD has helped build 82 new schools, as well as 11 colleges and universities. Our agency also helped open more than a dozen hospitals, clinics, and other healthcare centers. We've helped rehabilitate 20 parks and more than 20 fisheries and completed dozens of water and sewer projects. And I'm also proud to say that HUD has played a role to help nearly 5,500 businesses, most of them small businesses, to reopen their doors. This morning, you're going to hear from some of the men and women whose service was essential as HUD supported families in the Gulf. Earl Randall is, as our New Orleans Field Office Director, an outstanding leader and right at the head of our response to Katrina. Not only did Earl and his team work around the clock to aid the recovery effort, they did so while grappling with their own personal loss. They were among the storm's heroes, and I want to personally thank Earl for his excellent work in these last few years. He continues to represent the very best of our federal workforce. Earl is going to be joined by Todd Richardson, HUD's Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary in our Office of Policy Development. I have to say that Todd knows more about these issues than just about anyone, but even more importantly, he cares deeply about getting the policy right for those who count on us. And I know that he and Earl have put together a great presentation for you about the human aspect of this tragedy. Following that, they'll be joined on stage by 3 more of our colleagues. Marion McFadden serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs in HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development. Marion oversees a number of programs that were instrumental in the Katrina recovery effort. She's also done great work on the long-term Hurricane Sandy recovery, so be sure to ask her a lot of good and tough questions. Lynn Grosso is Executive Director in our Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office of Enforcement. Lynn brings an incredible wealth of knowledge concerning how we're working to ensure that all families, no matter their background, regardless of what they look like or how much money they make, can take part in the Gulf Coast's economic future. And finally, they'll be joined by Milan Ozdenik, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Housing and Voucher Programs. Milan was central to our work to not only rebuild damaged public housing, but also to help turn around New Orleans' once struggling housing authority. I don't have to tell you that over the last decade, the road to recovery that they're going to discuss has been long and it's been challenging. But I think that you would agree with me that it's also shown that while that storm was tough, the spirit of the people of the Gulf Coast has been even tougher. Their resilience continues to inspire us here at HUD because as much as we've accomplished in the last decade, all of us are very aware that our job is not done. Today, the city of New Orleans, for example, continues to grow. More than half of the city's neighborhoods have recovered 90% of their population from before Katrina, and 17 communities are larger than they were before the storm. But there's still so much more work to be done. I'm proud to say that we've worked with local leaders to build a stronger New Orleans and a Gulf Coast that all can be proud of for future generations. And as we mark 10 years, our work continues. We will keep working hard every day until the Gulf Coast comeback is complete. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to turn things back over to Jaime.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're going to take a brief pause to prepare for the next part of the program, and we'll be right back. All right. So next, I'd like to welcome Earl Randall. As the Secretary mentioned, Earl Randall is our New Orleans Field Office Director, and Todd Richardson, our Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary in our Office of Policy Development. And Earl not only responded to the crisis, he lived through it, and Todd is one of our data experts that when HUD works on something, it's not just about the output of dollars, it's about the impact that those dollars make, and Todd has a vast knowledge about our work on the ground. So I'll turn it over to them.
So the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, Great Chicago Fire of 1871, Galveston Hurricane of 1900, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. These were catastrophic events, ended many lives, changed lives forever, transformed places. Katrina joins these disasters of the last century in our language about transformative events. As the Secretary noted, over 1 million damaged homes, tens of thousands of lives were disrupted for many years. 1,833 lives lost. Our colleagues at FEMA can tell you the story of response. HUD's story, shared with a number of federal, state, and local agencies, is about the recovery of the last 10 years for the families and places most impacted by this storm. As noted in the introduction, I'm Todd Richardson, and my role after disaster is to find the data and make sense of it.
And I'm Earl Randall III, and I'll provide the on-the-ground and the human perspective behind the data that Todd presents.
The winds of Katrina caused damage over a very large part of the southern U.S., but the catastrophic damage of Katrina were in Louisiana and Mississippi. Although the storm was the same, the disaster manifested itself differently. For Mississippi, it was the 28-foot storm surge crushing the houses along the oceanfront, pushing them up against a raised rail bed.
And in New Orleans, the levee failures flooded tens of thousands of homes. And as you may have recalled, the floodwaters continued to rise until September 1st, when the water level in the city of New Orleans equaled that of Lake Pontchartrain.
The word we heard most often by victims and first responders was devastation.
The slide that you see now is the portion of the lower Ninth Ward where the levee breached, and the floodwaters devastated all of the homes in its wake. There were over dozens of homes that were just completely washed off their foundations, and people suffered a tremendous loss.
The debris removal effort led by the Corps of Engineers was massive. This is a transfer station for debris. As noted by the Secretary, more than 1 million housing units were damaged across 5 states. Over 278,000 of those homes suffered major and severe damage.
And you may have heard the staggering statistic that 80% of the city of New Orleans was underwater. Large portions of Gulfport and Biloxi were also inundated with water due to the 28 and 30-foot storm surge that approached.
More than 800 people, 1,800 people lost their lives, and 1 million displaced residents. We're now going to pivot from the destruction of Katrina to the recovery. These next data points are made possible by the United States Postal Service. This slide from the New York Times shows 1 year after Katrina where folks had relocated to using the U.S. Postal Service data. 270,000 households in the New Orleans metro area had filed change of address forms with the U.S. Postal Service, and 1 year later, 200,000 were still having their mail forwarded.
As a result of Katrina, New Orleans residents were spread all across the country. In the immediate aftermath, these residents were placed in various modes of transportation and just sent out to different parts of the country. But what did this mean? This meant that lives were changed forever, and stability had to become an essential factor in survival. The pre-Katrina life of everyone affected was temporarily frozen on 8/29. On a personal note, going back into the New Orleans field office 3 months later, I went to my desk. The calendar was set on the day we left. People that left coffee mugs were set in the same position, and it was an eerie feeling walking back into an office, seeing it that Friday the way you left it 3 months prior. And so that was the symbol of what people's lives were. When you left, when you eventually evacuated, whether you evacuated voluntarily or you were involuntarily rescued, your life was completely frozen at that moment in time.
So how long does recovery take? Again, the U.S. Postal Service is helpful because they can tell us about active addresses. So let's look at Orleans Parish. My friends at the data center in New Orleans have been tracking month by month the number of addresses that have been taking mail by zip code. The count of active addresses in New Orleans is now 90% of what it was before the storm. 1 year after the storm, it had been 50%. 2 years after the storm, 67%. At 3 years, 72%. And gradually, incrementally, each year, till 90% at 10 years. The recovery, however, has been at a different pace for different neighborhoods. In Lakeview, it was at 85%. That's the bottom line here. In New Orleans East, which had the most houses affected of any of the neighborhoods, which is the top line here, the red line, 82% of addresses have returned.
In these two neighborhoods in particular, Lakeview and New Orleans East, they both shared something in common. There was a higher rate of home ownership. There was also a higher rate of insurance in those areas. That's what kind of attributed to 85 and 82% of those individuals, of those residents in those areas coming back.
These two middle lines are the neighboring communities of St. Bernard Parish and the new Lower Ninth and Bywater areas. Their Lower Ninth, Bywater, 72% of its pre-Katrina active addresses are returned. In St. Bernard Parish, it's 63%.
The Lower Ninth Ward and St. Bernard Parish, they were pretty much the most devastated communities in the city of New Orleans. They were inundated with a significant amount of flood water. Their rate of return has been much slower due to the lack of insurance, as well as the mixture of the home ownership ratio and renters. There was a lower number of homeowners in those areas and a higher proportion of renters.
And the research supports this. The more severe the damage, the greater the concentration of damage, the longer it takes to rebuild, the less likely to rebuild. And if there's inadequate or no insurance, the recovery process is slowed down by years. So we have a few aerial photos, thanks to my colleague Dana Bress. So this was a picture of an area within the Lower Ninth Ward. In 2003, it had 95 homes.
And if you notice, the aerial shot in October of 2014, there were 47 homes. Just to add with the Lower Ninth Ward, if you looked at the previous slide and saw the cluster of homes, that was a cultural aspect. It was a way of living. Personally, my grandparents lived in the Lower Ninth Ward. Yes, both sets of my grandparents lived right around the corner from each other. So we had cousins, aunts, all in almost a commune setting. That was our way of life. That was our culture. But once Katrina hit, that all changed. But that not only for my family, but all of those families that lived in that same type of environment in the Lower Ninth Ward, in Lakeview, in Gentilly, all of the neighborhoods that were affected by Katrina, life in itself just changed at that moment. Things that you used to do on a daily basis, you couldn't do any longer because of the change in the dynamics.
In St. Bernard Parish, this is a few blocks in Araby. Araby borders on the Lower Ninth Ward, and in 2003, it had 84 homes.
And the aerial depiction in 2014 shows only 15 homes returned to that area.
HUD is the recovery funding of last resort. We only provide funding when there is a sense that the existing mechanisms, insurance, SBA disaster loans, FEMA assistance, the Corps of Engineers, will not be enough for recovery. HUD received 3 rounds of supplemental appropriation for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program to fill those gaps. We had initial appropriation of $11.5 billion. Clear that was not enough. That was followed by $5.2 billion, and then a final $3 billion when we realized that the homeowner recovery programs in Louisiana had more needs than had been anticipated. As this slide shows, private insurance played a big role. $41 billion, $18 billion for homeowners. The National Flood Insurance Program played a big role, paid out $16.1 billion for 211,000 claims. Philanthropy was has been very important in recovery, $6.5 billion. Tax credits have been an important part of the rebuilding, and as noted, HUD's Community Development Block Grant Program filling in those gaps at $20 billion. This slide notes how much of the CDBG funds went to each state. The majority of the damage and the majority of the resources went to Louisiana, followed by Mississippi.
As Todd mentioned, the CDBG disaster funds were the funds of last resort. But on the ground, those funds were the driving force in the recovery. It was with those funds that were creatively flexible, they were extremely flexible, and they caused the community to really think their design, to think how to meet their specific recovery needs. What was entailed and how do we address the plight of homeowners? How do we address the plight of renters? Fill in the necessary gaps for those businesses that were shuttered due to the disaster. Our CDBG disaster dollars filled major gaps in recovery, dealing with housing, economic development, and critical infrastructure. These funds were still had to adhere to several of the requirements that half of the funds used had to serve low income. They must follow the environmental, the civil rights, and the labor laws. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with disaster CDBG is that it doesn't come with preset structure. It's inherently incumbent on those communities to design and implement their plan of recovery. It gives them a template to address housing, infrastructure, and economic development, but they must design their criteria for recovery. And to simplify a lot of these matters, Louisiana and Mississippi both adopted a compensation program for homeowners. Essentially, it was providing substantial grants to homeowners to cover that gap in funding that was left by insurance and other resources. Now, by accepting these substantial grants, homeowners agreed to rebuild by a certain date. But if homeowners chose not to rebuild, then those homes would be deeded over to the state. In Louisiana alone, 130,000 families received road home compensation. This was an average award of $69,224. 92% of those individuals selected the option to rebuild, whereas 8% chose to deed their homes over to the state rather than rebuilding.
So again, how long does recovery take? From its low point in July 2006 of 98,000 active addresses to the 179,000 active addresses today, it's an increase of 80,000 active addresses over the decade. Most of these were likely supported in some form by the Community Development Block Grant or Low-Income Housing Tax Credit assistance that was provided. 42,000 of the road home stay and rebuild grants were in Orleans Parish, and approximately 15,000 affordable rental units have been developed in Orleans Parish, many through the low-income housing tax credit program, as well as with a small rental repair program using CDBG funds. So my read on this arc of recovery is that this first bump through July 2007 was likely due to people who had insurance or adequate insurance or needed just enough of the rebuild funds from CDBG to recover relatively quickly. But the rebuild from years 3 to 7 was slower, as many families struggled to manage their construction and others still did not have enough resources. In 2011, we surveyed the property owners who had not rebuilt up to that point, and their top 2 reasons for not rebuilding were they did not have enough money to do the work or they weren't able to get a loan to get the work done.
And from the neighborhood standpoint, looking at the speed of recovery, although 11,000 of the 130,000 road home folk chose to sell their homes to the state, the concentration of those that didn't choose to rebuild were heavily concentrated in St. Bernard Parish with 4,300 units and the lower Ninth Ward with 1,100 units. That's why we see that lag in their recovery. With this abundance of property being sold back to the state, it left a void. And from the aerial pictures, we saw that void that it left in those communities. The resilience of the individuals that did choose to come back to those communities, it's evident by their willingness to come back, but also to come back under circumstances that things will be different. Things will be, different from the way they were. And utilizing some of those vacant properties to do green initiatives, to work on drainage and subsidence from other aspects of the neighborhood to do storm runoff, rainwater runoff. So there were some aspects where individuals took that opportunity to take a more palatable palette to rebuild and to recover. So this was some of the evidence in St. Bernard Parish and the Lower Ninth Ward.
And so to build on a little bit of that, from our survey in 2011, we asked both movers and those who chose to stay, we asked them about the satisfaction they had with the current home they were living in. And both movers and those who chose to stay had about the same level of satisfaction. But in 2011, those who had chosen to move were much more satisfied with their neighborhoods. 70% were very satisfied with their neighborhood, while those that had chose to remain and rebuild, only 48% of them were very satisfied.
So as we look at that data point, when we talk about the satisfaction of those individuals that decided to come back and rebuild, we really have to delve into why did they come back to rebuild. A lot of those individuals chose to rebuild because they did so with the passion that they wanted to rebuild things like they used to be. But as I stated before, as of 8/29, things totally changed. The dynamics of a post-Katrina New Orleans were completely different. When you choose to rebuild, you choose to rebuild your plot in life. So when you look to your left and you look to your right and your neighbor doesn't come back, that's a difference. So that affects your psyche when it comes to rebuilding. If you walk to the corner store and the store that you frequented didn't reopen, that changes the mindset in your psyche to rebuild. So when we come back to rebuild and your church doesn't return, or any place that you socially frequent doesn't return, that does something to your psyche of rebuilding. So that's why when we can look at this data point and we can see that the individuals that chose to rebuild were less satisfied. They were less satisfied because with the passion that they approached rebuilding was totally different. So they had to reshape how they wanted to rebuild and how they wanted to relive in what's called a new norm.
Now let's shift gears a little bit here to another important topic. What happened to the pre-Katrina renters that were displaced by the storm? 2 years after Katrina, FEMA was still providing rental assistance to more than 40,000 families through temporary housing units and direct payments to landlords. Over 3/4 of those households had been renters pre-Katrina. None had been receiving housing assistance prior to Katrina. FEMA asked HUD to use its infrastructure of housing authorities, the agencies that administer our public housing and housing choice voucher program, to take over the rental assistance responsibilities for these families. The Disaster Housing Assistance Program, as we named it, was funded by FEMA, and HUD coordinated the work of the public housing authorities. From August 2007 to November 2009, HUD provided assistance to over 36,000 households. 306 public housing authorities in 49 states participated. In addition to providing housing, HUD's partners also provided case management assistance. Now, the average income of DHAP participants was $18,500. The transition off of DHAP for some was fairly easy. For others, it was quite difficult. This difficulty led to more than half of the DHAP participants eventually to transition from this FEMA-funded rental assistance to HUD long-term rental assistance, predominantly housing choice vouchers. In 2010, 55% of the DHAP participating families were receiving HUD rental assistance. We just looked at this for 2015. Only 35% of those folks are still receiving rental assistance from HUD. So they've been gradually transitioning off of this rental assistance, but it has taken 10 years. Of those nearly 13,000 DHAP participants still receiving housing assistance, however, we can tell a little story about where they are today. And we can see today that of those 13,000 that are still receiving housing assistance from HUD, 38% are in Orleans Parish, 21% are in other parts of Louisiana, 6% are in Mississippi, 22% are in Texas, and 13% are in other states.
And just one note on DHAP. A lot of times we miss the true story on what DHAP really did for individuals that were that were previously assisted with public housing. But DHAP stepped up to the plate and assisted individuals that weren't assisted with public housing before the storm. So individuals that lost everything in the storm, didn't have a job to go to, they were able to lean on HUD for assistance in that crazed aftermath of dealing with after Katrina. So DHAP not only took care of all of the HUD-assisted individuals that were affected, but it also stepped up to the plate to take care of individuals that just had no place to go with nothing to have in their baskets to take with them. HUD also worked with HUD-assisted privately owned multifamily housing as well. If we look at the slides, in Alabama, all 225 impacted properties have been fully restored. In Mississippi, 420 of the 422 impacted properties have been fully restored. And in Louisiana, 387 of the 407 properties have been fully restored. Now, this leads us into a longer conversation about the journey that HUD has taken with New Orleans over the past 10 years. And the symbol of that journey has been the redevelopment of the big four public housing developments: C.J. Peet, B.W. Cooper, St. Bernard, and Lafitte. Approximately 3,000 units of occupied public housing before Katrina was demolished. Approximately 1,500 unoccupied units was also demolished in the redevelopment. The redevelopment called upon experienced developers to come in and redevelop these sites. The funding sources range from HUD and Hano's $200 million investment, GO-Zone tax credits of $250 million, FEMA's $20 million, but significantly, CDBG disaster recovery kicked in an additional $115 million at a critical time in the nation's financial crisis to help get a lot of these developments over the finish line.
So prior to Katrina, the Housing Authority of New Orleans had 7,400 total public housing units, though only 5,146 were occupied, including the 3,000 occupied units at the Big Four. Families who had wanted to return to New Orleans have generally returned and been housed. Of the 5,146 original families living in public housing of New Orleans pre-Katrina, we have data that shows that in 2015, 3,303 are still living in housing assistance. 71% of those are in Orleans Parish. 7% are in other parts of Louisiana, 13% are in Texas, and 10% are in another state. This was St. Bernard Parish before Katrina. This is the new St. Bernard Parish, actually called Columbia Park at the Bayou District today.
And these are mixed income developments. They're both public housing and non-public housing units that include market rate units. Residents are mixed income levels. They're built with public and private funds. They include a mix of uses such as retail, recreation, education, technology. They're attractively designed. They're built with green building requirements. They're accessible and livable units to all. Now, we showed the before picture of St. Bernard, and we saw what's there after. Just to put some perspective in place, St. Bernard, the St. Bernard housing development was the largest in the city of New Orleans. But it was also one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of New Orleans. Prior to Katrina, the year before Katrina, in the St. Bernard neighborhood and surrounding neighborhood, there were 479 attempted felonies. 1 year after the development of Columbia Park, there were only 2. So we're not only changing the bricks and the mortar of public housing, but we're elevating the lifestyle, we're elevating life, we're elevating the quality of life for families that's living in public housing. So it went from one of the most notorious neighborhoods in New Orleans to one of the most desirable neighborhoods in New Orleans. If you vacated the city of New Orleans 10 years at the time of Katrina, and you came back now and exited I-610 at Parish Avenue, you wouldn't know where you were if you hadn't been back. So that's a testament to change. That's a testament to changing lives and redevelopment.
Post-Katrina, we've also invested in the redevelopment of a 5th development through our Choice Neighborhoods program. This is a picture of the Iberville-Tremé transformation here.
And in 2005, a combined 9,000 households lived in public housing or received voucher assistance. Today, Hanover is helping approximately 20,000 families as a result of the Recovery Act.
So we're helping more families today in New Orleans than we were 10 years ago. But New Orleans is a smaller city. It is growing, but it's a smaller city. In 2000, its population was nearly 485,000. In 2013, 379,000. The metro area is also smaller. In 2000, the metro area was 1.3 million. Today, it's 93% of that, 1.2 million. More than half of New Orleans neighborhoods have recovered 90% of their June 2005 population, and 17 neighborhoods have more population than they did in June 2005. So what about the next 10 years? Over the next 10 years, HUD will work with New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast, as we do with communities across the country. We'll continue to focus on affordable housing, decent neighborhoods, ending homelessness. And on that last point, one recent victory in New Orleans, reaching effective zero at ending veterans' homelessness.
And Ty, just to add that over the last 10 years, I've been extremely proud to represent this agency on the ground in New Orleans because, biasly, New Orleans is my home. I was born and raised in New Orleans. My wife says I'll probably never leave New Orleans. But I'm proud to say that HUD stepped up to the plate. The recovery of not only New Orleans, but the entire Gulf Coast and the entire portfolio of disaster-affected communities that we reach across this country are heavily dependent on the resources that HUD provides. If you look at a community without HUD's presence, you'll probably be looking at a blank canvas because everything that we touch as an agency helps to sustain those communities over the long haul. In the 10 years to come, I'm proud to say that the department is reevaluating and repledging its commitment to moving forward with the Gulf Coast because it's needed. You know, we've done a lot of great things over 10 years, but we still have a lot of hard work to do. And I'm glad that HUD is committed to doing that work. So I thank you and I appreciate it.
Thank you for taking the time to hear the HUD story here.
Thank you, Todd and Earl. Before we turn to the final part of the program, which is the question and answer, let me reintroduce the folks who haven't spoken yet. We have, going from my left to the right, is Miriam McFadden, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs here at HUD, Milan Ozdanek, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Housing and Voucher Programs, and Lynn Grosso, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Enforcement and Programs in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. For the assembled media, if you could please, if you're going to ask a question, go to the mic. So for the TV audience that's watching, I appreciate that. And folks can still submit questions via Twitter at HUD.gov or hashtag Katrina, and via email at HUDpublicaffairs@HUD.gov as well. While we wait for folks that might ask a question at the mic, we have some questions that have already come in. This is from Pam Fessler from National Public Radio. And maybe if we start with Todd, and anybody else, feel free to jump in if you guys can grab the mic there. The question is, has a shift from public housing to housing choice vouchers after Katrina actually had the desired result of moving low-income families to more mixed-income neighborhoods and opportunity? It seems to have just shifted people to other high-poverty neighborhoods, some of which are even less convenient for poor families than the old public housing projects in NOLA, New Orleans.
Well, I think one thing that's important to look about that is the statistic I gave about where the former disaster housing assistance participants that are still in our voucher program, they're not just in one place. They have moved to lots of places. They're not limited in their choices. The voucher has given them that flexibility. So that has changed where people can choose to live. It is hard to find housing in New Orleans and other parts of the country. Rents are high in many places, limiting some choices about the neighborhoods that you can live in. So it is not a perfect story. Many families are still in high poverty neighborhoods, but the voucher has given more choice than many of the families had prior to Katrina.
Did anybody else want to weigh in on that? No? Okay. Do we still have anybody from the, okay. We'll go to Russ Zimmer from Gannett in New Jersey, and we might start with Marion on this one, but anybody else feel free to jump in again. Nearly $1 billion was unaccounted for in Louisiana's Road Home program. Has that shaped how HUD interacts with New Jersey's RREM program? Is HUD more involved in RREM rulemaking? Are you more hands-on in general? And do these measures result in a more efficient but slower distribution of grant funds?
So we absolutely learned the importance of being hands-on with communities as soon as possible after a major disaster. When the Obama administration came in, immediately HUD and FEMA set to work creating a long-term disaster recovery framework to make sure that the entire federal government is there for communities. So we were able to work much more closely with New Jersey and New York in particular than we were with Louisiana post-disaster, post-Katrina. So we have absolutely been part of their designing their programs. I would say in terms of the missing $1 billion, I'm not sure exactly what that refers to, but I assume that it's a reference to an evaluation that was done by HUD's Office of the Inspector General that proved to be about $500 million, which was provided for elevation for homeowners who didn't actually have enough funds to get their homes elevated. One of the things that we learned in Katrina is that it is much more effective when the state or local government that's providing the disaster assistance is hands-on with homeowners in doing an actual homeowner rehabilitation or reconstruction program, as opposed to handing funds over to homeowners and letting them manage the recovery process on their own.
Great. The next question we have, nobody's lined up. How is the Sandy recovery progressing in comparison to where the Gulf Coast was at this point in 2008, about 3 years after the respective hurricanes?
So it's always very difficult to compare disasters. In looking at the statistics, Hurricane Sandy damaged or destroyed about 650,000 homes all up and down the eastern seaboard. There were 650,000 homes damaged or destroyed in Louisiana alone. So you just can't compare them side by side. But I would say the design in Louisiana of giving money to homeowners allowed them to push a lot of money into homeowners' hands at about the 2-year mark. But that doesn't mean that the recovery is moving any more quickly or that it did move any more quickly in the Gulf Coast than we're seeing in Sandy. What we're seeing in Sandy is that each of our grantees is doing a real reconstruction program and managing the process, and New York State and New Jersey in particular are moving at a pretty good clip. That said, for families who are waiting to have their homes repaired, it's never fast enough.
Kind of along the same lines from Emily Dooley at Newsday, are there any lessons learned from Katrina that have informed how HUD handles disbursement of Sandy recovery money?
So we could go on all day, I think, about the many lessons that we learned, but that first one is to ensure that the grantees are doing real homeowner rehab programs, that Homeowners are not left to their own devices to try to manage their recovery because when we get CDBG disaster recovery funding, it's because the scale of the disaster has been so large. And it's just proven to be too much to ask for all homeowners to manage their own contractors in dealing with the process. So that's one of the most critical points for us.
And just to add to that, one of the most critical lessons learned is the lesson of preparation. I think Katrina, Rita, Ike, Gustav, the BP oil spill, and other disasters in Louisiana has taught us to be prepared. It's taught grantees to share information that they wouldn't regularly share had it not been for all of those events that had taken place before. But it's taught us as a department to reach out to those grantees and encourage them to share across state lines, across boundaries. I think one of the jewels that came out of the Gulf Coasters recovery is that you've pretty much created a college of knowledge between Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida that they're sharing on how to recover. And that knowledge has also been shared with our friends on the East Coast, with New Jersey, with New York State, New York City. So the lessons that we've learned is that critical lesson that you don't start from scratch when a disaster hit. You have resources that you can tap, you have peers that you can tap, and you also have an agency in HUD that's going to step up to the plate and recover with you.
I would just add to that point that at the federal government, we learned to do that as well, to work better across the federal government. The president set up the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force just a couple of months after Hurricane Sandy to ensure that we were coordinating, not just on housing, but on all the aspects of the recovery, particularly infrastructure work. We saw a lot of frustration in the Gulf Coast about the pace of infrastructure projects because of the need to do permitting and coordinate across various federal governments. So we wanted to make sure that we had a forum for that, which is proving effective on the Sandy recovery that we did not have after Katrina.
We have a question from a webcast viewer, Peter Moskovitz, a freelancer. Is HUD tracking where Katrina evacuees live?
So, largely no, but we do know where folks live who are still receiving housing assistance. So in the charts I provided as part of this presentation, the two sort of numbers I gave for disaster housing assistance program and for what happened to the former residents of public housing, for those that are still receiving housing assistance, we can see that they have chosen to live in multiple places. But for the former public housing residents that are still receiving housing assistance, the vast majority have returned to Orleans Parish. In the disaster housing assistance program, many of those folks weren't from Orleans Parish. They were from other parts of Louisiana or Mississippi. And many have chosen to stay in Texas, which received a lot of families, or other states. As you can see, a lot of families chose to go to other states. So we do see that folks have moved, and we have seen that New Orleans is a smaller place.
As I grab the next question, I just want to remind folks in the room we only have 3 or 4 minutes left, and if you want to go to the mic, go for it.
Hi, my name is Kate Macedo. I'm with Fox Business, and my question is for Mr. Ozdenek, please. So I want to ask about the new IG report that just came out stating that more than 25,000 over-income families are in public housing now, some of those making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we've been talking about Texas a little bit today, and that was where this happens. It was in the top 3 of where this actually happens. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us about how the department would justify spending taxpayer money on this, as well as if there will be any changes made.
So your question is specifically about over-income families?
Yes,
So,
in public housing.
I think it's important to note that the law allows for housing authorities to serve over-income families if upon original admittance they were under the income limits. And in fact, having over-income families to some degree helps to diversify the incomes of the families living in public housing developments. And in fact, the programs that we support in terms of redevelopment have that component piece to it in large measure, trying to mix both the incomes as well as the uses to create diverse neighborhoods. So I think that while there is some disagreement between the OIG and the department about the benefits to having a diverse income group living in a particular development, we'll continue to follow the law and reach some accommodation with the IG about following up with recommendations about how to, identify and address their concerns as well. In 2014, the law did change to change the flat rent policy for public housing. So for those families that are living in public housing that perhaps are over income and paying flat rents, their rents will indeed go up in accordance with the law, no more than 35% in any of 3 successive years. So the rents for those families will be pegged more to fair market rents than they currently are based on income.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Robert Garcia. I've got 2 quick questions. First, is HUD now better prepared for natural disasters after Katrina? And then my follow-up to that would be, what would be the biggest takeaway for HUD from Katrina?
So I guess I'll start with that. We all have different roles in this. I think we are better prepared. We continue to try to improve each year with the things that we know we need to do better. So I don't think we could say that we're 100% fully prepared for another disaster on the scale of Katrina. That was very, very significant. But we did learn a lot from Katrina, and we are making improvements each year based on those lessons so that we, in fact, could be more prepared for a big disaster.
So let me build on that, if you don't mind, Todd.
Yeah.
I think one of the big takeaways for me is how we work with other federal partners, and specifically for me, it was FEMA, and taking over their rental assistance efforts. So that was really critical. But I'm with Earl, right? We've just thrown a lot of statistics at you today, but at the end of the day, when we implemented DHAP, we knew that people were traumatized, and not just the folks who had to evacuate, but the folks that were there to help as part of the recovery. And so we insisted as part of the DHAP process that there was strong case management. So we knew that families, and especially families that were most vulnerable, elderly, disabled, who had to get on the bus and go to Houston, arrived with the clothes on their back. And so it wasn't just about FEMA or the Housing Authority paying rental assistance. It was about furniture, pots and pans, the reading glasses that were left in the home that needed to be replaced, medications, doctors, help with those wraparound things that affected so many of the families that had to leave New Orleans and the surrounding areas. So that is, to me, one of the biggest takeaways from our work in terms of that recovery part, making sure that we're treating evacuees as real human beings that are going through trauma and giving them that level of comfort and service that is necessary during that period. So for me, that's the big takeaway.
And thank you for the question. From a civil rights and equal opportunity perspective, I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned is the importance of working closely with states in developing their plans and anticipating the implications and consequence of policies that might on their face seem neutral, but can have very adverse impacts, if you will, on communities of color. I think we've learned to not focus strictly on the needs of homeowners to rebuild, but also to focus on the rebuilding of rental housing stock, particularly low-income rental housing stock, so that low-income renters that tend to be people of color more so than homeowners have an equal opportunity to return, and that we replenish the community as closely as we can to the way that it used to be for everybody. So I think that's one thing that we have learned to do very quickly and anticipate.
Just one note on that. Another takeaway that we've learned as an agency is that there's no cookie cutter approach to disaster recovery. What may happen in Louisiana on the Gulf Coast will be totally different than what happens on the East Coast or on the West Coast with wildfires and other disasters. We know that now, and so we're better able to address the needs of those communities where they are and what they're dealing with, and so it gives us a better approach to working with those communities right where they are at the time of disaster.
In terms of our responsibility as stewards of the taxpayer dollar, I think what we've learned from Katrina and Sandy, as well as some of the 2008 disasters, is that we have a role in encouraging communities to use the federal dollars that we provide to them every year to ensure that their communities are more resilient, and to use our experiences around the country to educate communities about what they can be doing with their own dollars as well. Because every time they're building, they should be thinking about the current risk and the future risks that their communities face.
Well, we're just about out of time, and just if there's any final thoughts from our panel here, and we'll wrap it up. All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and being here in person.